Salut, comrades. Hope everyone had a good Pesach and May Day. With the leak coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court detailing the overturning of Roe versus Wade, several cities in the so called United States have seen an explosion of direct action relating to the potential snatching away of abortion rights. As soon as the memo had leaked on the evening of May 2nd, both pro choice and anti abortion protesters swarmed to the Supreme Court, with the pro choice protesters overwhelmingly outnumbering the opposition's. On May 3rd, direct actions began taking place outside of Washington, D.C., with the first notable one occurring in Portland, Oregon. According to journalist comrade Elisa Azar, a forced birth pregnancy crisis center in Portland had its windows smashed out and some messaging left on it. These disgusting and dangerous sites tell pregnant people that abortions cause breast cancer and severe mental health issues. They pressure and traumatize people with their evangelical propaganda, fearmonger with no valid or scientifically accurate claims, and most oftentimes have little or to no training, including when they attempt abortion pill reversal, the unscientific and unethical practice of ingesting high-dose progesterone. They also overwhelmingly lack medical professionals and any real resources in their centers, offering little more than a pregnancy test and psychological pressure and severe trauma. Hashtag abortion saves lives. The same day, comrades struck a second forced birth haven located in Frederick, Maryland, vandalizing it with graffiti reading, "Not a real clinic," and "End forced motherhood." In Los Angeles, protests turned violent as the LAPD attacked abortion rights protesters demonstrating downtown. According to a communiqué posted on It's Going Down, here on Tongva land in so-called Los Angeles, actions turned into street confrontations with fascist LAPD officers and federal DHS police. At approximately 8:40 p.m. or so, a confrontation started between autonomous protesters seeking to take the intersection and march to City Hall while encouraging those from an adjacent protest to join, and cops in an undercover van who were attempting to drive through and force the protesters to move. Cops continued to escalate the situation, beating, shoving, and threatening several protesters, while continuing to try and force their way through the crowd. This eventually escalated into a situation where protesters were moving up Hill Street as cops continued pushing and beating them. 2 arrests took place as LAPD officers attacked protesters on Hill Street, but were quickly surrounded and forced to give up their arrestees. Protesters then began calling for the crowd to continue uphill to avoid an attempt at kettle by cops. LAPD would attempt to kettle protesters 2 more times that night, both cases showing the LA Block's familiarity with the concept and ability to outmaneuver these attempts through continuous, unpredictable movement and strategic positioning. The crowd retaliated by smashing windows of cop vehicles and throwing rocks and bottles at the pigs, injuring one. The same pigmobiles were graffitied with "Google LASD gangs." The protests ended with the vandalization of a Planet Fitness gym and City Hall building. On the night of Friday, May 6th, a third forced birth center in Denton, Texas, known as the Loreto House, was plastered with graffiti reading, "Not a clinic," and "Forced birth is murder." Security cameras were also strategically spray-painted as to prevent comrades from being identified and arrested. Given the location and political significance of Texas to the American abortion debate, with Texas being the first of several states to pass highly restrictive anti-abortion laws, this action was met with a frenzy on social media by notorious anti-abortion lobbyists. These individuals went so far as to claim the comrades involved in the direct actions were looking to dox and harass crisis pregnancy center volunteers. On May 7th, there was another direct action. From a communiqué posted on Abolition Media, Colorado anarchists visited the St. John the 23rd Catholic Church of Fort Collins last night, leaving multiple broken windows and painted messages in retaliation for its material support of dangerous anti-abortion groups like 40 Days for Life. These groups have terrorized local visitors of Planned Parenthood for years now and must not be tolerated. Solidarity. The chaos thoroughly exploded on Mother's Day when numerous actions took place outside of various American churches. This was not something that took anyone off guard, as activists had given several warnings beforehand that they were planning what they hyped up as a zero hour of sorts. Outside the Basilica of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, a gigantic group of pro choice demonstrators descended upon the church to block what was to have been a countermarch by a pro life group towards a Planned Parenthood nearby. The action to deter the anti abortion march was a success, as the oppositions canceled their plans entirely. Standing in the rain, the protesters sang, "Thank God for abortion," as a small horde of anti-choice men stood scared shitless in front of the church door. Among those praying was a known white supremacist groyper scumbag who yelled, "Your body belongs to me," to a woman protester, and said later on livestream that a protester of color deserved to be enslaved. This should give question as to whether or not the Archdiocese of New York are giving platform to actual fascists, not to mention the presence of fascist scum in the anti-abortion movement as a whole. No arrests were made during this protest, and both sides dispersed without escalation. On the night of May 8th, the headquarters of a notorious anti-abortion and homophobic lobbyist group located in Madison, Wisconsin, was firebombed in a Molotov attack by anarchists. A wall of the building burned while other parts were tagged with graffiti of recognizable anarchist slogans, such as 1312, code for ACAB, or All Cops Are Bastards, and If abortions aren't safe, then you aren't either. On May 10th, new reports came out about an anarchist collective called Jane's Revenge taking responsibility for the direct action, the group's name a reference to an underground women's movement which operated in Chicago from 1969 to 1973, which helped lower-income women receive abortion services before Roe, known as the Jane Collective. The communiqué reads as follows. This is not a declaration of war. War has been upon us for decades, a war which we did not want and did not provoke. Too long have we been attacked for asking for basic medical care. Too long have we been shot, bombed, and forced into childbirth without consent. This was only a warning. We demand the disbanding of all anti-choice establishments, fake clinics, and violent anti-choice groups within the next 30 days. This is not a mere difference of opinion, as some have framed it. We are literally fighting for our lives. We will not sit still while we are killed and forced into servitude. We have run thin on patience and mercy for those who seek to strip us of what little autonomy we have left. As you continue to bomb clinics and assassinate doctors with impunity, so too shall we adopt increasingly extreme tactics to maintain freedom over our own bodies. We are forced to adopt the minimum military requirement for a political struggle. Again, this was only a warning. Next time, the infrastructure of the enslavers will not survive. Medical imperialism will not face a passive enemy. Wisconsin is the first flashpoint, but we are all over the U.S., and we will issue no further warnings. And we will not stop. We will not back down, nor when we hesitate to strike until the inalienable right to manage our own health is returned to us. We are not one group, but many. We are in your city. We are in every city. Your repression only strengthens our accompliceship and resolve. Jane's Revenge. A few days later, on May 13th, the same pro-life group claimed Jane's Revenge had left them death threats over phone messages. "Burn, little Jesus freaks, burn, burn, burn," said the message. Keep in mind, Wisconsin is one U.S. state which has trigger laws banning abortion immediately once Roe is overturned. Back in Texas, a Catholic church in Houston was desecrated by activists who graffitied the church's doors and allegedly stole the church's tabernacle and Eucharistic hosts. The tabernacle was found outside of a Burger King Wednesday morning. The fact that the desecration of the Eucharist is the highest form of sacrilege in Catholicism makes this action all the more notable. So, are crisis pregnancy centers and churches legitimate targets? Absolutely, 100% yes. Those who are denouncing these attacks are completely oblivious to the role these institutions play in furthering the restrictions on reproductive freedom. Even if these institutions aren't directly dictating political policy, they still act as ideological apparatuses which condition the population into accepting reactionary and misogynistic ideology, which is what enables these laws to be enacted in the first place. Look up what soft power means, guys. Crisis pregnancy centers were literally established to shut down abortion providers. Now, anti abortion leaders are calling comrades possessed by evil forces for taking part in these actions. They claim we target the church more than state officials because we're possessed by dark forces. I'm honestly not surprised, given these douchebags' absolutist views of good and evil and their blatant ignorance when it comes to understanding how the patriarchal dynamics they're reinforcing will be of tremendous service to capital. These are the same people who brag about how well their organizations have fought against abortion rights, only to cry foul when abortion rights activists give them a taste of their own medicine. These same forced birthers want to blame these attacks on Democrats, knowing full well Democrats are too spineless to carry out any action that goes beyond voting. They refuse to accept a radical left that demonstrates strength and resilience, and I think that's exactly what this is about. They are scared. They have shown many times that they are scared, and the solution or the answer is for the left to be even more militant and to show these people that we're not going to back down and that we have some teeth. Now, back in DC, waves of militant protesters demonstrated outside of the houses of Supreme Court justices involved in this case. This is probably the most notable of all of these actions that has gone down in the past 2 weeks. On Monday, May 9th, hordes of activists took to the streets, surrounded the houses of Justices Alito, Kavanaugh, and Roberts, and demanded accountability, screaming, "Abort the court." These actions outside of Alito's house in Alexandria, Virginia, were led by the leftist group Shut Down DC. The U.S. Congress unanimously passed a bill to expand security to the families of all 9 Supreme Court justices, a showing of how much these mass protests scared the political establishment. It became so intense that Alito and his family were all taken to a secure location to hide from the demonstrators. Furthermore, politicians in Biden's cabinet denounced the protests. Biden's lackey, Jen Psaki, posted on Twitter that protests should never include violence, threats, or vandalism, and that judges perform an incredibly important function in our society, and they must be able to do their job without concern for their personal safety. Now, look, politicians need to answer to the people. The government needs to be more afraid of us than we are of them. And protests outside oppressors' homes are not a new invention either. During the labor movement, workers used to protest outside the bosses' homes in order to intimidate the parasites and demand that the workers be given their rights. You can look this up and find plenty of examples. I would also add that this is a perfect example of how the people have lost all trust in the Supreme Court. The fallout from this case will force the court to find ways to regain its legitimacy in the eyes of the masses. That is inevitable. Over Shabbat, there was another mass wave of protests taking place in several American cities, most noticeably DC and New York. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets under the slogan, "Bands off our bodies." In DC, over 20,000 protesters squared off with a few dozen or so counter-protesters who shouted, "End abortion violence," with one said counter-protester being hit in the head with a bottle. In New York City, thousands of protesters marched over the Brooklyn Bridge. They too were met with a handful of counter-protesters who had to be guarded by the NYPD. One common message in all of these protests is the fear that overturning Roe could lead to a domino effect, whereby other civil rights gained from decades of struggle could be chipped away over time by an increasingly tyrannical government scrambling to find ways to hold back capitalism's inevitable decay. So, now I'm going to give some commentary. I've obviously been very passionate about feminist issues for a long time, and to be honest with you, I'm quite disappointed with how the overall radical left in America is dealing with this. Almost every single discussion I see regarding abortion focuses on reframing the issue as a culture war, that it's merely something used by the ruling class to create an artificial barrier between the left and the working class, which is presumed to be socially conservative, even though that is highly, highly questionable. And it turns the working class into a monolith, arguably, when it's clearly not. Um, and then there's all sorts of shit about where Planned Parenthood is getting their donations from, as if Planned Parenthood is the sole provider of abortions. And within this, the one group of people I never see being mentioned in this entire discussion are the people who are going to be in need of abortion services when Roe is overturned. Even if we assume that the struggle for abortion rights is all something top down, it still doesn't negate the fact that people are going to need abortions regardless. And I mean, the government and the ultra rich and the CIA and whomever can throw as much propaganda at us as they want, but none of it would stick unless the material conditions were already there. And this is something I've had to tell people again and again. Um, Comrades need to figure out ways to help people in need of abortion services. These laws are going to force pregnant people to travel long distances to states where abortion remains legal, which is going to cost them so much money. And this is already an issue if we compare it to the situation here in so-called Canada, where the biggest issues we face in regard to abortion is not legality, but accessibility. If you live in a remote area, you will be driving over 9 hours to access abortion services, and it's even worse for Indigenous women, which is, again, something that the left never, ever wants to talk about in regards to this issue. One other thing that's important to mention is that while we're being taken aback by the lengths our comrades will go, we shouldn't think these protests will become naturally left wing. This was the left's biggest mistake when it came to both Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, two events where I was present and saw how well liberal sellouts were able to railroad both movements and use them as election fodder. We can't keep repeating the same liberal slogans like my body, my choice, or anything which can be easily appropriated by the mainstream media. We need to stay radical and demand things in the context of what the status quo won't provide. Push things as far as they will go. Bottom line is, don't let anyone turn us into foot soldiers for the Democratic Party. We don't want to be a wing of the ruling class. That's how our movements are always used against us. And we have to be sure that this movement isn't used against us as well. And what we're forgetting in all of this is how women or females are an exploited and oppressed class. There's all sorts of issues regarding reproductive and domestic labor, which I seldom ever hear from other comrades. My understanding in this whole situation is that the ruling class in the states where abortion is going to be banned doesn't want to have to keep paying for things that would incentivize childbearing in order to keep birth rates up. So they would rather ban abortion and most forms of birth control so they have the ability to cut away at those services without sacrificing the birth rate. And to be honest, it's kind of a myth that low birth rates are all a conspiracy from above, because oftentimes I hear this. In actuality, the biggest reason for refusal to procreate under capitalism has everything to do with the lowered quality of life for parents and children since the start of neoliberalism and the overall decline of world capitalism. Abortion and birth control access give female-bodied people the ability to fight back against this bullshit. If people in power aren't going to make things better for us and our children, then we're not going to provide them with any children. And let's face it, the only language which the government understands are money and blackmail. I actually might make a video on birth strike and why the labor movement started the birth control movement in the West, because it's an interesting topic and something the modern left doesn't talk all that much about. Anti-abortion laws amount to strike breaking, and these anti-abortion activists, even if they call themselves progressive or Catholic socialists or whatever, are basically strike breakers when they're campaigning for these laws. I pray that after the revolution, after socialism is brought to the entire world, we will embrace children and have as many children as possible who will share in our utopia. Um, I think that would actually be very beautiful. May God use these direct actions to bring us one step closer to global revolution and redemption. Love and solidarity. This is Chaya Bat-Tzvi. I'm out.